It's episode 104, the launch of the Radio Times. But previously, in our moment-by-moment guide through the British broadcasting century. Autumn 1923 has seen a BBC on the up. They've come out of the Sykes inquiry rather well with a new licence fee deal, and on the technical front, they've just launched simultaneous broadcasting, meaning they can now send broadcasts from one station to all the stations and all the listeners throughout the land. So as their schedules get more sophisticated, maybe it's time for some listings that can tell us exactly what's on the air, the times of the radio. The Radio Times. Yes, this time, the Radio Times is launched. Still to this day, the only magazine I'm aware of with its own song. A song that was banned on the BBC for favouring one magazine. Now, we have previously done a podcast on the history of the Radio Times. That was for the centenary of the mag. Find episodes 75 and 76. We interviewed the editor Shem Law, Radio Times connoisseur and expert Dr. Steve Arnold, and the grandson of its first editor Leonard Crocombe, that's Justin Webb of Radio 4's Today. I mean, the programme is called Today and it's on today. This time we're going to focus more on the actual launch of the Radio Times rather than its century-long history, and zoom in on issue number 1. But we'll also hear a little more from Radio Times editor Shem Law in parts of the interview that we have not previously played you. Also Dr. Martin Cooper, author of Radio's Legacy in Popular Culture, here later this episode. So if it's on, it's in, and it's on this episode of the British Broadcasting Century.
Hello, this is Paul Carenza calling.
This is London Calling.
Hello, it's Paul Carenza here, Guildford calling. Delighted to have your company as ever on the British Broadcasting Century podcast. It's episode 104, and we've reached in our moment-by-moment guide through the history of British broadcasting. We're at the launch of the Radio Times. Now, we have already done a podcast on the history of the Radio Times, but we can't just move past it, and I didn't really want to do the thing of repeating an old podcast. So we're going to take a little bit of that, condense it, and also look further at what was in the very first issue of the Radio Times. Plus, unheard chat from Radio Times editor Shem Law and Dr. Martin Cooper, whose book Radio's Legacy in Popular Culture looks at, Radio's legacy in popular culture. The clue is in the name. In case you're wondering where we go from here, by the way, next episode of the podcast we launched the Aberdeen station 2BD. That launched in October 1923. A week after that, Bournemouth 6pm was launched, and so we'll bring you that. And then the BBC launched different criticism shows. The weekly drama criticism, the weekly literary criticism. Sounds very negative, but essentially it's, reviews of what's going on in the stage and on the page. In amongst all that, interview guests include James Cridland, the radio futurologist. We've got academics, authors, musicians, comedians, plus around Christmas this year. Have we got a Christmas special for you? Can't tell you much more at this stage of what it's going to involve, but it's going to be marvellous and quite merry. And then after that, we gear towards the BBC's first anniversary. So 14th November 1923, the BBC had a big birthday bonanza of a show, and so we'll celebrate that probably in about 7 episodes' time. For now, though, episode 104, it's the launch of the Radio Times.
This is London calling. As the Radio Times has now made its appearance, and will give you full particulars of the week's programmes in advance, this will be the last of my Saturday night talks on coming events from 2LO.
Ah yes, this new publication then would bring you what's on the radio in a whole different way. So you no longer needed broadcasts like that, summarising what was going to be on the air, although it would have been quite useful still, I would have thought. So let's begin with what led to the Radio Times. Now we summed this up at the very start of episode 75, so I'm just going to bring you 5 minutes from that episode with the voices of Radio Times editor today Shem Law, Justin Webb of Radio 4, and Dr. Steve Arnold, Radio Times expert and collector. If you don't want to hear what you've previously heard on the podcast, you can zip forward 5 minutes. But why would you want to do that when you can hear about how the Radio Times was launched? Here's our Graham with a quick reminder.
So what's the story behind the creation of the Radio Times then? There was the press ban in early 1923.
The newspapers were always against the BBC.
A Radio Times connoisseur and collector, Dr. Steve Arnold.
Because it was seen right from the beginning to be poaching on their land. You can't broadcast the news because that's our domain. It was the newspapers actually kicking up a fuss and saying, if you want to publish programmes in our papers, we're going to charge you as though they're adverts. and there was a boycott, and that's seen as the point where Reith thought, actually, we'll have our own paper.
Reith's famous quote out of one of his diaries in the 60s, where he sort of muses on the fact that the increasing vulgarity of the Radio Times really rather makes me wish I hadn't started it in the first place. And, you know, he had to start it because no one was going to print his radio listings. Because when he went to the newspapers, they said, there's this thing here you keep doing, which is called the news. That's what we do. Actually, you can have, we'll take them, but you'll have to take them as adverts. It'll have to cost you. And he worked it out. It was going to cost him an absolute fortune. He might as well start his own magazine.
So the kernel of this idea came in February of 1923, and it led to behind-the-scenes plans afoot. I wonder if it was helped in some way by the BBC attitude to drama. You see, with many theatrical agencies taken against these Johnny-come-lately broadcasters, fearing they'd steal their audiences from theatres, the BBC moved a lot of drama production in-house. So I wonder if maybe that gave Reith the idea that we can do the radio listings in-house as well. So this became a reality. Late in 1923, the publishers George Newnes were given full editorial control, and the BBC supplied them with listings and articles, and off they went to the printers. But it was all in a bit of a rush at first. They didn't have time to advertise for an editor, so they got Leonard Crocombe.
My grandfather, Leonard Crocombe, was the first editor of the Radio Times.
Radio 4's Justin Webb. He spoke to us on an earlier edition of this podcast.
And he was a friend of Lord Reith's, who I think put him in that position. He was a part of the setup. He'd been a magazine editor of Titbits and various kind of very well-read, popular magazines with funny little stories and jokes and things. But he was a considerable figure and was obviously able to kind of turn a sentence quite well.
Leonard Crocombe, your grandfather, was broadcasting on London 2LO with a monthly show in 1923 before the...
I didn't know that.
Mm.
No, you've told me something I didn't know about.
Okay. But reading out bits of Titbits, basically, pretty much.
Right.
Funny stories. Yeah.
There was an elderly lady who, I regret to say, got very intoxicated one night and was taken to the police station.
March the 14th, 1923, the BBC let him on the air with funny tales like this.
So the next morning, she was brought before the magistrate, who was a very terse sort of man. And he said to her, he said, name? So she said, Angel. He said, address? She said, Having. Oh, he said, how did you get here? She said, on a rainbow, dearie. So he said, right, 6 weeks for skylarking.
Crocombe later wrote of how his Radio Times story began with the tinkle of my phone bell one summer morning in 1923. The mellifluent tones of my friend Arthur R. Burroughs, then director of programmes, spoke to me. Would I lunch with him that day? He had something important to discuss. We met at Simpson's. The important matter that Burroughs wished to discuss was the scheme by which my employers were to publish the Radio Times in collaboration with the BBC. So actually, when Crocombe was first approached, the Radio Times didn't have a title. That was given just a fortnight before publication, 10th of September. John Reith noted, everything is now in shape for a BBC magazine, and from various alternatives, I chose Radio Times for the title.
He was making it up as he went along. You know, you create a broadcasting service and no one really knows what they're doing. Yet magazines have been going for a long time. So, you know, he had to hire magazine people. And of course they wanted to make it entertaining and interesting and fun for people. And of course, as far as he was concerned, that wasn't educating people. You know, I think Reith would just prefer it if every programme was some sort of lecture on something. You know,
you're probably about right.
From Wireless World magazine, 19th of September 1923. The British Broadcasting Company's new magazine. This new magazine, which the BBC is putting out, and I'm sure our readers will give it a hearty welcome as it fills a long-felt want, ought to be particularly valuable to the trade. It will print all the programmes of all stations a week ahead so that everyone can see exactly what is happening. The trade will be able to arrange demonstrations on a particular night. Ah yes, a hidden benefit. Back to Crocombe, who returned from a month's holiday in Belgium to be told I was also the editor of this Radio Times, with a colleague, Herbert Parker, a nephew of the Right Honourable J.R. Klein's MP, to look after the policy end for the BBC. Moreover, it had been decided by the BBC that the first number of the Radio Times must be ready for the press in 7 days. And by St. Caxton, we did it. Arthur Burroughs arguably helped with that first one too. Steve Arnold wonders if Burroughs actually counts as the first guest editor for issue number 1, because, well, he was a celebrity back in those days. He certainly greeted listeners and readers on the front page. What's in the Air by Arthur R. Burroughs, Director of Programmes. Hello everyone, we will now give you the Radio Times, the good new times, the Bradshaw of broadcasting. May you never be late for your favourite wave train. Speed 186,000 miles per second, 5-hour non-stops. Family season ticket, first class, 10 shillings per year.
Episodes 75 and 76 continued with the history of the Radio Times, but from here on in, it's all new stuff. So you heard there a little of Arthur Burrows' opening article, the front page editorial. We'll hear a little more from what was inside that first issue very shortly, but first of all, was Arthur Burrows actually the editor? We mentioned there that Leonard Crocombe was the editor, and that's generally been how the history books have said it. Dr. Steve Arnold tells me that Herbert Parker was, really the first editor, with Arthur Burrows probably handling the majority of that launch edition, is why his face is on the front cover, I suppose, with that opening article. They didn't really have experience of making magazines, and Reith was actually offered a percentage of the takings of the Radio Times, given that he hadn't actually signed up to run a magazine. Reith turned this down, later regretted it, he could have made a fortune. So on the BBC side, you've got Arthur Burrows providing content and properly editing the magazine alongside Herbert Parker. Steve notices this, for example, written by Gladstone Murray, the BBC's Director of Publicity, in March 1925.
The Radio Times was first published on the 28th of September 1923, the joint editors being Leonard Crocombe, editor of Titbits, and Arthur Burrows, shortly replaced by Mr. Herbert Parker on the BBC side.
Yes, so was Crocombe more a publisher than an editor?
At first, the BBC's functions consisted mainly of supplying programmes and information about them through Parker to Crocombe.
So actually defining who was the first editor of the Radio Times, rather trickier than the official record might let on. Burrows, Parker, Crocombe, the trio. Now, I've got the first edition of the Radio Times here in front of me. I've been after this for quite some time, looking on eBay and all sorts of different corners of the internet. I did have from eBay the 8th edition, which I've got here as well. But obviously the first ever issue is a rather nice thing to get. So it was when I was doing a show, an evening of very old radio, which I toured around the land, coming soon to Ealing and Petersfield, Hertfordshire, Chelmsford, Norfolk. Do come and see me, paulcarenza.com/tour for details. But I took this show to Much Wenlock in Shropshire, and a fella came up to me afterwards and said, do I have the first edition of the Radio Times? And I said no. And he said, well, I do, and I'm trying to get rid of it. He's having a clear out. He sold it to me, but to make it an informal sale, I think it's fair for me to say that his price was the price of a good bottle of whiskey. Now, it's up for you, dear listener, to decide what you think is the price of a good bottle of whiskey. I know what I thought. And anyway, he's happy, and I've got the first edition of the Radio Times here in front of me. So shall we have a little read through? For those who support on Patreon, there's a half-hour video essentially looking through this issue, reading out key bits, seeing any key names in the listings. If you want that, it's there on patreon.com/paulcarenza. That just supports this podcast. So thank you to the dozen or so people who support us there. And of course, more are welcome at any time. Link is in the show notes. But we'll have a little whiz through some of the key elements, shall we, while we're here. Arthur Burrows, then, is on page 1. Normally that's the spot that John Reith would then occupy. Page 2 of the Radio Times has a big article, A Miracle of Broadcasting, and then some guidance on choosing a radio set by the Assistant Chief Engineer A.G.D. West. Then a couple of bigger articles, which essentially is just the text of a talk that had been previously given on the radio. So nothing to do with broadcasting as such, it's just the content of the talk you would have heard. Page 3 of the Radio Times has its first cartoon. It's titled Our Wireless Village Concert, and it just reminds us, really, that actually some people didn't listen to the radio at home. They would go to their village hall, where a radio set would be set up on the stage with a loudspeaker, and people would sit in rows and watch it. So that's what the cartoon depicts, and the caption is there from a Mr. A. Lotment, ha ha ha, who says, "Would you kindly remove your hat, madam?" Because the woman in front has a big hat. The joke, of course, being, there's nothing to watch. Profiles of people who'd been appearing on the radio, and indeed their pictures, because it's quite nice to know sometimes what they look like. And that's still a feature in the Radio Times today, the face behind the voice, just near the back. Could that be the longest running feature in the Radio Times, I wonder? And then the listings begins with Sunday's listings, and it's London first of all. The very first item listed is the 3 o'clock organ recital at Steinway Hall, London, the Triumphal March in E major by Gilmour, as played by Edwin H. Lemaire. Not one I'm familiar with, I think it's fair to say. London, Birmingham, Manchester, Cardiff, Newcastle, Glasgow, their listings then follow. Then you've got letters from listeners. The very first letter in the Radio Times is actually from Spain. It's a listener from Asturias in Spain, Augustin Victero, but his letter was in Spanish and it was translated essentially asking when the Spanish talks would be scheduled. So in fact, he's asking, would you let me know when a certain broadcast will be on? And of course, the entire point of the Radio Times was to tell you when those things are on. So he was saying he could pick up the Manchester station there in Spain. Quite impressive. Must be a very powerful valve set. And there's even in the letters page some criticism as well. Yeah, they weren't afraid to actually say that some listeners didn't quite like the specificity of some of the lectures.
Do they think the majority of their listeners are really interested in such lectures as the decrease of malaria in Great Britain, how to become a veterinary surgeon, the new Rent Act? Would it not be sufficient to have only one thoroughly classical night a week? Frankly, it seems to me that the BBC are mainly catering for the listeners who own expensive sets and pretend to appreciate and understand only highbrow music.
Ah, yes. Years before Points of View, its spirit was alive and well.
If you go back to Lord Reith and the fact that all he ever wanted was professors telling you really, really dry things, and it caused a huge problem.
Editor Shem Law in a previously unheard bit of our interview.
Because people really didn't listen to the radio. You know, for starters, you had to either build it yourself or go and buy a really expensive thing that somebody else has built. And frankly, I'm sure if Lord Reith had his way, it was a sort of middle-class preserve. When you go through old copies of the Radio Times and you start going through stuff in the 20s and 30s, you find some bright spark said, I tell you what, if we put a football match on the radio, people might get interested. It's no different from when Sky started. They stopped short of putting sort of working class sport like darts and stuff on the television, but they, you know, the varsity rugby match is on the cover of Radio Times because that's the big sporting event this week. You know, it's of interest to several thousand students in Cambridge and Oxford, I would say. You know, the boat race, you know, the Grand National. The minute sport unlocked the doors, people wanted to buy radios, and radio sales went through the roof at that point, you know. And it's probably the same correlation to dishes people put on the side of their, you know, and the fact that Amazon now buy up sporting events. They're all at it because they know that's the way to get people to subscribe. And as high and mighty as the BBC like to sound occasionally, they were no different.
Yeah. Darts, I remember, I think I read, was put on the telly by the same guy who created Songs of Praise. So there you go.
There you go.
Donald Baverstock.
Absolutely. And I love watching darts on telly.
Well, there you go.
You know,
Thanks
there you go.
You can hear much of our interview on the previous episodes 75 and 76, but here's something we've not played you already. If you didn't know who Shem Law's dad is, you'll find out at the end of this.
I think your dad has employed me in the last year or two. Dare I mention Spitting Image? 'Cause I think.
Well, he was an illustrator. He used to draw. Then they moved into caricaturing in 3D, so that they made models. They were on the cover. I'll show you some in Radio Times. Made them on the cover, and then somebody stupidly said, "Can you make them move?"
If you couldn't spot already, Shem Law's dad is Roger Law, one of Fluck and Law, who created Spitting Image. Art and broadcasting of a very different kind.
Spitting Image was born, and it was an ITV programme for starters.
Well, I'm glad I was writing for the Spitting Image reboot a couple of years ago, so I'm glad of the work, so thank you for that.
Spitting Image, frankly, wouldn't have existed without the fact that the only game in town that seems to be these days is celebrity, and unfortunately television and radio in the early days, that wasn't the aim, but that was the direct consequence of it, is that we created all these celebrities.
Yes.
And we don't really know what to do with half of them these days other than make more television programmes.
Very good point. In fact, I was reading that we heard of the radio uncles, Uncle Arthur and Uncle. Yeah. I sort of remember once from Reith that they were called uncles because Reith was rather insistent we didn't get celebrities in the early days, and that way it anonymises them a little bit.
Back in issue 1 of September 1923, Peter Eckersley, raconteur, bon viveur and chief engineer, he turned regular journalist for his occasional article, What the Wild Waves Are Saying. For this first Radio Times, he wrote on that breakthrough from a month earlier, simultaneous broadcasting, and how it began.
It was amazing in those days to be up in the little room in Marconi House and to listen to the extraordinary number of sounds that could be picked up with a little intelligence and a pair of headphones. Even now, at the beginning of regular things, little mistakes may occur, as for instance when an announcer, not quite familiar with the ropes, cried out in his agony, and with the switch open and when he was connected to all stations, "What the do I do now?"
There's some sheet music on page 16, which is the result of a competition for a new song. It's called Across the Bridge of Dreams, and that was then performed on the BBC. There's the Children's Corner with Uncle Rex, who begins, "Hello children everywhere. You know the old familiar signal, of course, but this time you can read it in nice black print, instead of hearing it through the microphone. That'll be a change.
Sounds different, eh? I mean, looks different. Now, what do I really mean? I cannot think how to put it, but you know what I mean, so we will leave it at that. And that's that.
Now that to me, as someone who writes regular magazine articles, smacks of someone who's got a word count to fill and just keeps on writing. There's an article on the SOS broadcasts that save life by radio. There's a farewell message from Uncle Jack as he leaves Newcastle and goes to Bournemouth, a very popular broadcaster there. And a feature on Rob Roy. That was probably the highlight of the week, the simultaneously broadcast drama, the first of its kind. We mentioned that on the previous episode of the podcast. It was firstly done in Glasgow, just for Glasgow, and then repeated, restaged completely, with military bands and bagpipes, and heard across the land on different BBC stations. There's a coupon page, unused in my copy here, to fill in to send with feedback of your favourite shows. Oh yes, the market research began with issue number 1. And at the back of the magazine especially, but also throughout,
Ericsson, the aristocrat of headphones.
adverts for wireless parts, receivers, headphones, all that sort of thing.
Eddie Swan Headphones, the name which means better reception. 40 years of research work have enabled us to discard everything but the best.
No ads on the Beeb on the air, but in these pages, it was fine. It's magazines, and the adverts are gloriously evocative, I think.
Listen in with an Efescaphone. No technical knowledge is needed. The appearance of Efescaphone sets is all that could be desired. The layout is neat and compact, the cabinet work distinctive. In the set illustrated, the instrument panel is enclosed, when not in use, by a neat roll shutter, and the headphones accommodated in a cupboard in the base. All connecting wires are out of the way at the back of the cabinet. 2-valve set £25, 3-valve set £31.10.
Not all ads were for wireless things, though.
Are you frightened of meeting people, mixing in company, going to social gatherings, dances, etc.? Do you lack self-confidence? Suffer from nervous fears, depression, blushing, timidity, or sleeplessness? Become self-confident, full of courage, bright and happy, by sending immediately for particulars of the Mento Nerve Strengthening Treatment. Guaranteed cure or money refunded.
Or just beneath that.
Height increased in 30 days. No appliances, no drugs, no dieting. The Melvin Strong system never fails.
And the back cover, the final words of the last page of the first Radio Times, an advert for
Sterling loudspeakers, wholly British manufacture, unsurpassed for quality. Price £2.15. All advertisements for Radio Times should be addressed Advertisement Department, George Nunes Limited, 8 to 11 Southampton Street, Strand, WC2.
And those are the final words of the first Radio Times. So that's basically issue number 1, and over 5,000 issues later, it is still going strong. We will return briefly to September-October 1923 before the end of this episode, but time for one more guest, I think. If you were to look through the Radio Times over the years, now and then you might find a film or a TV programme or hear a song on the radio that is on the radio, as in about radio, as in radio's legacy in popular culture. That is the title of the book by academic and broadcaster Dr. Martin Cooper of the University of Huddersfield. He's a friend of the podcast, and I began by asking him what was his way into this project, looking at how radio is represented elsewhere in culture. It was in fact a song about radio in a film.
The song that got me into it was a Van Morrison song called Caravan, which is in a Hollywood movie called The Last Waltz. And Van Morrison comes on stage. It's Martin Scorsese directs this film. It's all about the last concert of the band. They were the backing band for Bob Dylan. But Van Morrison comes on stage and he sings Caravan, which, if you know the song at all, it's quite old. He talks about turn it up just a little bit because you know it's got soul, radio. And it's like a call and response song, a really emotional song. That's what got me into this subject area, I think. Much more recently, and perhaps this keys into what we're doing right now, is a novel which is sort of a murder mystery, but it's based on listening to podcasts, and it's called Asylum Road by Olivia Sujic. And the idea is that the two people, they listen to true crime podcasts, but it kind of brings up to date the theme of radio. It's a gripping novel. It's worth reading. A bit scary, but
I've been watching lately Steve Martin and Martin Short, Only Murders in the Building, which is this. They've taken a modern approach to sort of a whodunit for a TV drama by, let's make a true crime podcast while we investigate it, sort of thing. And it just speaks to today, doesn't it? In that way, it
does. The problem that I think we've got on television in particular is how do you portray making a podcast?
Yeah.
Now, if people could see what we're doing now, we are two men sitting with a pair of rather unpromising headphones on our head, talking into pretty ugly microphones. We're not telegenic by any stretch of the imagination.
That's why we're here.
That's right. Yeah, good face for radio. That's the old jokes are the best.
Yeah.
But how do you portray it? There was comedy detective series that the BBC did called Shakespeare and Hathaway.
Oh yes, yeah.
They had one episode where there was a young woman who was making a podcast. And if I've got the story right, it was about the death of her father, I think, something like that. But it was terribly difficult to portray on camera making a podcast. She used to pull this microphone out of her bag, but it wasn't connected to any wires, and it wasn't a radio mic. I'm sad enough I can tell what brand a microphone is just by looking at it on the screen. So it's terribly difficult. And then you've got people looking at a laptop as if they're listening to it.
And I listen to my podcast on the move, on the drive, on the dog walk, out and about. The other thing I find is you listen to, or you watch, I should say, I think particularly films. I think TV maybe does it better, but you watch a film that includes a scene in a radio studio. You often get real life radio presenters, and they read a script or trying to sound like improvisational, but it's been written by the screenwriter, and it never kind of works in the same way because it's so difficult to recap unless they're given complete free rein. Unless they say, like, go Nick Ferrari, go and be Nick Ferrari.
That's right.
And we'll film you.
Yeah.
Otherwise, if you script that improv, it just never kind of leaps off the screen in the same way.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think probably one that does work, but it's because he was given a little bit of freedom, was Robin Williams in Good Morning Vietnam. There are some of those scenes there where he is actually doing improvisation. You can actually tell because the guy in the back of the shot looks like he's corpsing. The other thing that gets me about watching radio studios on television is the presenters never wear headphones. And I'm thinking, how does that work? Because it doesn't. And I actually had this problem when I'm teaching young journalists about radio. The first time they go in the studio, they don't put the headphones on. And I go, sorry, you've got to put the headphones on because you've got to be able to hear yourself and to hear the other people that you're talking to, particularly if they're on the telephone or if they're in an outside broadcast. And they don't get it. They think, I can just sit here and talk into this microphone. So there's a kind of technology break when you come to depict radio on television. The downside of that, of course, is people don't look attractive with headphones on.
Right.
Great example is Frasier.
Oh, yeah.
Classic sitcom. He hardly ever wears headphones. And also the desk he's got. Sorry, I'm going on to a technical trivia trip here. But
this is the place.
Yeah, the audio desk that Frasier has got in front of him is not an audio desk. He just pushes buttons. Which is not what you do in a real studio. Yeah.
Which is in a shame, because real studios can be exciting, and if you can see on YouTube there are, I think, especially like the Capital Radio DJs when they were at their height doing carts and everything, and it's a blur, and it's impressive.
Generally speaking, the BBC has always been really open to allowing people to poke fun at it being a massive cultural institution. In 100 years, it's become part of our lives. You could, if you like, say it's as big, as important as the church, as Parliament, and all these other grand institutions. But what the BBC has, which I think marks it out from other great institutions like that, is that it allows people to poke fun at it. And indeed, it enjoys poking fun at itself. W1A with Hugh Bonneville, if you remember that poked serious fun at the bureaucracy and the post-John Birt era of the BBC. Hugely funny. I think doubly funny, too, for those people who had worked for the BBC in those years.
Yeah, Harry Enfield and Paul Whitehouse as well, doing their tribute to 100 years of British broadcasting. And similarly, they did a tribute on BBC Two, and you see this odd thing of them recreating Shooting Stars and Never Mind the Buzzcocks, playing all the characters. If I Got News for You, you've got sort of Harry Enfield doing an Ian Hislop impression. So you've got comedians playing comedians from a BBC show, mocking another BBC show. It's very, meta, tongue
tongue in cheek sort of thing. Television eating itself, I suppose.
Yes, and I think we enjoy doing that because I think when it comes down to it, broadcasters, I include myself and you as well, we know what we do is special, but it's not too important. When push comes to shove, we can see the funny side of what we do.
Can't take it too seriously.
No.
Dr. Martin Cooper's website and blog is prefadelisten.com, all one word, apart from the .com bit, and his book is Radio's Legacy in Popular Culture from Bloomsbury. Lastly then, let's just bridge any gap from this episode to next in terms of our timeline. Let's get from late September 1923 to the BBC's Aberdeen station launch on October the 10th, 23. So that first Radio Times at the end of September landed very well. It sold over 250,000 copies, selling out its print run. Here's what the Sheffield Independent newspaper said on 28th of September 1923. I've just received from the British Broadcasting Company a copy of the new Radio Times, which is to be their official organ. Judging by the first number, this magazine will meet a much felt want for listeners in, and Mr. Palmer, the popular literary manager of the BBC, is to be congratulated on the initial production. Mr. Palmer, we've got 3 editors already, no room for a 4th. It is concerned with the entertainment and educational side, not the political side of wireless, and as such is a triumph. A few days later in the press, the idea of a University of the Air was floated in a letter from David Cuthbertson to the Scotsman newspaper on the 1st of October 1923. Sir, I find that in the course of education there are many schemes brought into play, even the teaching of languages by means of records on the gramophone. Still newer methods can be adopted. There is a vast body of people who cannot attend a university throughout the day. They are thus debarred from acquiring a degree, at least in Scotland. But since there is so much done by wireless and listening in, why should not the government establish a centre for broadcasting in the evening, so that a university course might be sent to all interested? I admit there may be a drawback in the fact that not all professors and lecturers are articulate speakers, but this broadcasting could be done by clear enunciators. A university for all is surely feasible, since science has made such rapid progress, and lectures at home from the air would be as popular as listening in to concert music. Besides, if developed, it would lessen the pressure on the universities. The following week in the newspaper then, they report that the Sykes inquiry has finally published its findings. See a couple of episodes ago for that, and how it shaped the BBC going forward. In brief, British broadcasting is here to stay, and the BBC can continue with some more secure funding. So it was all going rather well for the Beeb. They've got the Radio Times, simultaneous broadcasting, and to celebrate, London 200 sent out a symphony concert live nationally for the first time, showing what could be done. It was just the small studio-sized London Wireless Orchestra, conducted by Percy Pitt, and it included guest violinist Daisy Kennedy, playing Saint-Saëns Concerto in B minor. Daisy Kennedy was one of those profiled in that first Radio Times. The Birmingham Gazette heard every note clear and distinct, rich in tone, conveying the soul of the violinist in her work, while the Western Daily News concluded, this marks a new era in the development of listening in. Thanks as ever to Andrew Barker, our newspaper detective, for these. So then the second Radio Times hit shelves, of course, a week after the first. That's generally how it goes. And it included one of the funnier, more frequently quoted items of the Radio Times' early days. A listener's hand-scrawled postcard was photographed and printed in full with a thick black box around it. It read rather austerely, "In memory of Tannhauser, murdered by the London Wireless Orchestra, 19th of September, 1923. What a review. Everyone's a critic. The magazine noted underneath that picture, the above is a photographic reproduction of a listener's postcard. The director of programmes does not resent criticism of this kind. The editor likes it, for it provides amusing copy for the Radio Times. Of course, the director of programmes, Arthur Burrows, arguably was also the editor, or at least one of the editors. Thank you, Steve Arnold. The Radio Times welcomed amusing copy, as do we. Our inbox is always open for your emails. paul@paulcarenza.com. Do drop us a line if you have any comments or feedback for the podcast, or things you would like to see, or things that you wouldn't like to see, or more appropriately, hear. It's an audio medium. Well, my thanks to Martin Cooper and to Shem Law. Thank you to the Radio Times for issue number 1. and every issue since, telling us what's on the box, whether that's the box without the screen, the box with the screen, or the small box with a little screen that we now keep in our pockets. Oh yes, the Radio Times adapts. Next episode, we move on down the timeline. The BBC launched a couple of news stations. Yep, sorry Radio Times, more space is needed in the listings, because alongside London, Birmingham, Manchester, Newcastle, Cardiff and Glasgow, the original BBC deal was always for 8 stations. So let us add Aberdeen and Bournemouth to the listings and to the airwaves. Both stations launched in October 1923, so next time our guests include author Gordon Bathgate with an excerpt from his book, Aberdeen Calling. Links to that and all the other books and things mentioned in this podcast are in the show notes. Do check them out on the episode page of this podcast to easily see where to go next to read more. You can also find us on Blue Sky, Facebook, look for British Broadcasting Century. We're still on X, just about. On Substack, search for Paul Carenza on there. I write blogs there about BBC past, present and future. Patreon.com/Paul Carenza, of course, supports the podcast. Or coffee.com, that's ko-fi.com/Paul Carenza, if you would like to chip in with a one-time tip. Thank you for it. We have no advertising, and this is a one-man show. Your license fees do not support this podcast. You can, of course, help this podcast out for zero cost by sharing it with your friends, in person, online, whatever. I say zero cost, it may cost your dignity, but that depends on how loud you shout it. The British Broadcasting Century is a solo-operated podcast, nothing to do with the BBC whatsoever. It's presented and produced by Paul Carenza, and original music is by Will Farmer. The books of note this episode include The Radio Times cover story by Tony Curry, and Those Radio Times by Susan Briggs. Thank you for listening. Do subscribe if you haven't to this podcast, and ensure you join us next time for episode 105, the launch of the Aberdeen station on the British Broadcasting Century.